behalf of the Lovecraft Arts and Science Council, Niels Hobbs, the Necronomicon Convention, we welcome you all to the great city of Providence, the birthplace and home of H.P. Lovecraft, whose birthday we celebrate on Sunday. We are pleased you are here. To further welcome you, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Lynn McCormick, who is here representing the mayor of the city of Providence.
Good evening, everyone. Before I start, I just want to give another round of applause for Gigi and that beautiful music. Thank you so much. And thank you, Barnaby, for emceeing tonight. On behalf of Mayor Taveras, I want to welcome you all here to Providence, Rhode Island. We take great pride in our history and in our artistic community in particular. As you look up the hill, you will see Rhode Island School of Design, the best art and design college in the world, and Brown University. So the melding of science and art is very, very much what we do here in Providence. I know Niels Hobbs and his amazing committee of people have done a tremendous job putting this conference together. They have been working for over a year with the city, with the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and with arts organizations, restaurants, bookstores, to make this a full-blown experience for all of you. So I want to thank Niels and congratulate him and his committee, and he deserves a huge round of applause. I also want to thank many of the local arts organizations that have worked very closely with the convention. Waterfire Providence, the Rhode Island Historical Society, the Providence Athenaeum, the Providence Art Club, and Brown University's John Hay Library have really pulled out all the stops to make sure that all of you have an amazing experience here in Providence. And also Big Nazo Puppets, who actually worked with AS220 on a special surprise for you tomorrow night at Waterfire. And I take great pride in that because it's part of a youth workforce development program we have in arts in the city of Providence. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the culmination of all that work tomorrow night. I don't have much to say other than you are going to be wowed by the next few days. I am just so impressed with the organization of this convention. You will experience Providence, in the Providence of your dreams, the Providence that you've read about in H.P. Lovecraft's writing. We really do pride ourselves on being a place of tolerance and curiosity, and we hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful experience here in Providence. And I want to also just thank S.T. Joshi for being here tonight to share his work with us and to help us in the city actually crank it up a notch in terms of H.P. Lovecraft and showing off what he did here in Providence. So thank you very much. Have a great convention. Look forward to seeing you all around town over the weekend, and I will turn it back to Barnaby. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And I want to talk a little bit about why we're here today. Niels, as Lynn has been saying, has been working for the last year for this, and I should introduce myself. I'm Barnaby Evans, the director of Waterfire Providence, and one of the things we're very interested in is creative placemaking. And as we got more and more excited about what was happening with the convention and all these sort of things, we talked to Niels about the idea of bringing the keynote speech out of the hotel and into a place that was right in the texture of Lovecraft's life. Because this was, of course, the church where he went to Sunday school, briefly, very, very briefly, and we'll hear about that in a moment. But I was also so delighted to have Gigi join us as the organist. Not only is she a brilliant organist, thank you so much, but she so rose to the occasion as we pitched this. She even learned that Norwegian chant, which we play at Waterfire all the time, and thank you, that was absolutely gorgeous, Gigi. That is one of the Angelstrijk's pieces of Norwegian sort of folk religious tradition, and the intention is it's an arrow that pierces the heart of you from its sheer beauty. So we thought we'd start with that moment of the sacred before we talked about the misadventures in Sunday school of a certain individual we're here to gather. But I also want to very much thank the First Baptist Church for letting us host this. Stan Lemons is here representing the church as the church historian, and I would be delighted to introduce Dr. Stanley Lemons to come up and talk a little about the founding of this church and Roger Williams and the place of tolerance that Lynn mentioned.
Thank you. On behalf of the First Baptist Church in America, I'd like to welcome you to the Meeting House. It's an altogether fitting place for this convention to assemble because H.P. Lovecraft was associated with this. This year, we are celebrating the 375th anniversary of this church. It was gathered by Roger Williams in 1638, and he would hate this building probably, but this building itself was built 238 years ago. And I might make the point that H.P. Lovecraft hated this church, but he loved this building. I hope you understand the distinction between the church is the people and its theology and all. The building is something else, and he loved this building. Roger Williams came here, booted out of, was banished from Massachusetts Bay, and he came down here and he established the first secular government in modern history, anywhere, where religion and citizenship were separated. He believed in religious liberty, not tolerance. He thought that was a lower kind of thing, but he believed in religious liberty. And so he set up a state where church and state were always separated. Lovecraft was briefly a Sunday school student in this church. His mother, his grandmother, and his aunt Lillian and Aunt Anna were all members of this church, having joined in 1883. Lovecraft, of course, was born in 1890 and was, he says, attended his last service here in 1895. He was just 5 years old. And he also says that he became an atheist by the time he was 8 years old. So by 1898, he's out of the place. But he was actually, from some of our folklore, was kicked out of the Sunday school because he became enamored of the Romans and the Greeks and came to think that they were better than the Christians. And so he tended to side with the lions against the Christians in the field. So he was kicked out. And he came back, though, to visit the building, and he would take people in here and show them around. But he had only a brief association with the church as a body, but had a long association with the building as a place.
Thank you, Stan. Dr. Lemons was talking quite precisely about this Providence, specifically the city of Providence, being the first place in the world where a government was established on the principle of freedom, tolerance, and freedom from persecution. So welcome to a city that you'll find to be remarkable in many, many respects, with a great arts community and a wonderful place. And we are in this place in part because Lovecraft was very interested in places. He writes specifically about this in his letters, but he also was a very early preservationist, and I would make the argument that some of these buildings that we still have here that we could celebrate are because of Lovecraft's interest in the built environment. But he writes that his writings was so inspired by specific places because he felt it was the only visceral experience that could truly move people. So we've weaved that through some of the things we're adding to the conference this year, and I think you'll find that as you wander Providence in all these many manifestations. Niels, would you like to come up, or you... I think Niels should come up, absolutely.
Thank you all. I feel like the rest of our guests, our speakers, shouldn't be the only ones to be abused by this microphone, so I'll see what I can do with it too. So far, so good. Anyway, once again, to reiterate, I'm essentially just going to repeat all the things that have just been said by several other people who are far better speakers than I am. But first off, absolute thank you so much to all of you for coming out to this. You are absolutely the thing that is making this the event that we hope that it is. Thank you so much to essentially all of Providence, in particular Barnaby Evans, who hasn't gotten an introduction. Barnaby was Barnaby and Waterfire, I should say, were one of the first people and organizations locally that came on board and essentially almost immediately clicked with the same sort of dreams that we had. The dream of essentially bringing Lovecraft back to Providence and giving him the throne in Providence that he deserves. So I'd really like to thank Barnaby in particular for that. As you will know, if you come to Waterfire Saturday night, you will see some of those dreams. Some people might call them nightmares, disturbing visions that we shared that almost immediately we're like, oh my God, he's suggesting the things that we only dared to dream about. So the fact that those things are now actually this weekend going to be coming to fruition is very much in large part thanks to Barnaby and to a number of other people in the room too. Is Morgan Greff here still? Morgan Greff over there from the Rhode Island Historical Society, one of the other entities in town, one of the other organizations that has always placed an emphasis on Lovecraft as being somebody that Providence should be proud of and engaged with as a cultural resource. Likewise, in fact, the city of Providence as well, Lynn McCormick's office, a number of other people in the city hall, including the mayor himself, Mayor Angel Tavares, have really come on board and have come to see, if not haven't already seen a long time ago, see Lovecraft as this important cultural resource for us to cherish, essentially. Lovecraft was certainly an incredibly flawed character. We talk a lot about the tolerance of the colony. It's remarkable that that's what the colony was based on, was this emphasis, a shelter for people that were essentially cast out from other places. And yet remarkably, Lovecraft obviously was not exactly tolerant of many things around him, kind of famously so, perhaps infamously so. But again, that's kind of, to me, that's the thing that makes Lovecraft a very fascinating character. And also, I think that's Lovecraft reflects a lot of the complexity of Providence proper. Providence as a city. There's a lot of different facets to Providence. As I think you'll know over the next few days, the vast majority of them are pretty amazing. So I really hope you all get to enjoy a lot of Providence. Like Barnaby said, it was very important to us that we showcase more than just the inside of a convention hall. We wanted you to get out and explore Providence and see the beautiful city that we see. A number of you have already experienced that. I see Mark Morrison nodding his head. Mark, who, by the way, maybe wins the award for the farthest traveled from Australia. But he's not the only one. I think there's a few other people from Australia. His wife, Penny, is with him. I'm sorry, wife? Yes, okay, we'll say wife. Pardon me. Anyway, a few other people many people have traveled from far outside of this country. So I'd like to thank all of you in particular for coming. Finally, once again, I just really would like to thank, as other people have, the church, the First Baptist Church in America, a very significant place for us to be able to have this. And in particular, again, sort of thanks to Barnaby for having this amazing idea of having Gigi Velasco come and join us. Honestly, like my vision for what this evening was going to be like was just shattered entirely. Like it has been so much more incredibly powerful and moving than I possibly could have dreamed. Largely thanks to Gigi's involvement. Thank you so much, Gigi. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
So there are three surprises you'll find in the church. Two surprises in the church and three surprises you'll find. I won't tell you more than that, but pay attention. The Waterfire, really working with Niels and all this group, was very intrigued about placemaking. And there are about 10 different projects that I'm not going to take time to go into that are around that we encourage you to find out. But I do hope you will buy the Eye of Providence t-shirts so that you can go home and talk about the great experience you had in our city. With that, I would delighted to be introducing S.T. Joshi, our keynote speaker, the leading authority on H.P. Lovecraft, Ambrose Bierce, one of my favorite authors, and H.L. Mencken. I mean, there are three fascinating men right there. And authority on the realms of the supernatural and fantasy. He's edited many books. You know him very well. You know his work. Please join me in welcoming S.T. Joseph.
Thank you. I can add one little tidbit to what was said before about Lovecraft's love of this church. You remember the famous passage in The Call of Cthulhu, where, part of which is set across the street in the Fleur-de-Lis building, an artist studio then and now. Now, Lovecraft hated that building because it was Victorian. Anything Victorian was a subject of loathing for him. And what he wrote in The Call of Cthulhu was, there's the Fleur-de-Lis building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Breton architecture which flaunts its stuccoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. So that's bad, this is good. What I hope to address here briefly, if possible, I can't see the time very well, briefly is how did Lovecraft get to be world famous? He certainly wasn't world famous in his time. He was a man who did not publish a single book of his stories in his lifetime. 5 different occasions, publishers approached him or he approached a publisher about a collection. Every time, those negotiations failed for one reason or another. At the very end of his life, only one story appeared as a separate book, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and it was poorly printed, full of typographical errors, distributed only a few hundred copies. I do not doubt that Lovecraft, as he lay dying in his hospital bed at Jane Brown Memorial Hospital, not far from here, in the early morning hours of March 15th, 1937, was envisioning the ultimate oblivion that would overtake his work. Lost as it was in those crumbling pulp magazines, which were already then disintegrating into dust, weird tales, astounding stories, amazing stories, let alone his essays and poetry and letters, some of which had never been published. It would be no surprise if he thought that his work would simply fade away with his own body. But his survival, at least in the short term, was the result of the great devotion of his friends. Robert Barlow, his literary executor, only 19 years old, took a long bus ride from Kansas to Providence to go through his papers after his death and donated the bulk of them to the John Hay Library. An act of incredible foresight, because those papers laid the foundation for for later scholarship that would raise him to world stature. August Derleth and Donald Wanderai spent their own money and their time and effort to start the publishing firm of Arkham House for the specific purpose of publishing Lovecraft stories in hardcover. And those editions were well received at the start, although I think some reviewers looked upon them more as a tribute to friendship than for their purely literary worth. Weird fiction at that time was not highly regarded as a literary form. Most mainstream critics did not believe that you could write genuine literature of horror and the supernatural. Indeed, in 1945, Edmund Wilson, then so-called Dean of American Critics, the leading literary critic in this country, decided to review some of Lovecraft's works, and his judgment was not favorable. He said, in a book review that published in the New Yorker, 1945, the only real horror in most of these fictions is the horror of bad taste and bad art. Well, that doesn't sound very good. Well, Mr. Wilson may have thought he was burying Lovecraft, but Lovecraft refused to be buried. The first paperback editions of Lovecraft emerged right around that time, and they may not have been distributed widely, but they, again, set the stage for his later renaissance. The 1950s actually were a rather lean period for Lovecraft's work in general. Arkham House was going through some tough times. could not keep Lovecraft's work in print. They themselves only published a few titles in that whole decade. But interesting things were happening overseas. The first editions of Lovecraft in England appeared in early 1951. A few years later, more surprisingly, Lovecraft became translated into foreign languages, first in France in 1954 and then in Spain in 1957. The French, as they had done a century before with Poe, hailed Lovecraft as an exemplary writer of what they called le fantastique. The French had no prejudice against horror fiction as a literary genre, and so they championed Lovecraft. German translations, Italian translations followed soon thereafter. In the early 1960s, Arkham House was able to reprint Lovecraft fiction in 3 substantial volumes and keep those volumes in print. The revenue from those editions actually came from those early film adaptations of Lovecraft. We remember them all: The Haunted Palace, Die Monster Die, The Shuttered Room. They're campy and perhaps a little crude, but they gave some money to Arkham House, and that was good, and they started planting the seed of Lovecraft's great emergence as a figure in popular culture. Indeed, as the 60s advanced, a very strange thing happened. Horror fiction all of a sudden became a best-selling phenomenon. Ira Levin published Rosemary's Baby in 1967. William Peter Blatty published The Exorcist in 1971, and then the early novels of Stephen King started publication in the early 70s. Lovecraft rode the crest of that popularity. Those Arkham House editions were reprinted by Lancer Books and then by Ballantine Books, and sold over 1 million copies, apparently, over the next several years. So Lovecraft was becoming firmly implanted in popular consciousness, indeed to such an extent that Time magazine took notice of Lovecraft in its June 11th, 1973 issue, in a lengthy review. But popularity is one thing. Critical esteem is a very different thing. Literary history is littered with the corpses of popular writers who then faded from the scene and deserved to fade. Their popularity was a transient phenomenon, subject to time and whim. Would Lovecraft meet that same fate? Perhaps not. What happened in the 1970s is that shortly after August Derlett's death in 1971, a new crop of Lovecraft scholars emerged to take Lovecraft much more seriously than had been done in the past, to study him more searchingly with greater analytical skill. Critics like Dirk W. Mosig, Kenneth Fagg, David E. Schultz, Barton St. Armand, Professor Brown, Peter Cannon. Their work was, in a sense, showcased at one of the great events that this city has held, the first World Fantasy Convention, held in Providence in 1975, theoretically to celebrate the entire realm of weird fiction, but it had a significant Lovecraft component, and there were many individuals from Mosig to Fritz Leiber to Robert Bloch and Frank Belknap Long who all came to celebrate Lovecraft's legacy. This was about the time when I emerged on the scene in a very tentative manner. As a teenager, I had read Lovecraft in my public library in Muncie, Indiana, and I knew that I had to study this curious Providence writer. I knew I had to come here to absorb the influence of Lovecraft and to get a sense of what he meant as a writer and as a thinker. Luckily, I was accepted at Brown and spent the next 6 years there doing as much research as I possibly can while still attending classes. I did a significant amount of work, including a bibliography, and I spent years correcting Lovecraft's texts. They had been printed with many errors in previous editions, but I corrected most of those. And these were reprinted by Arkham House in the 1980s. They gained a bit of attention, but Lovecraft was still very far from achieving renown as a leading writer of world literature. However, around that time, other scholars emerged. Stephen J. Mariconda, Robert M. Price with his very lively magazine, Crypt of Cthulhu. Will Murray, yeah, I hope Price is here somewhere. He's a great guy. Robert H. Waugh. The work of these scholars was commemorated in another great event that took place here, the H.P. Lovecraft Centennial Conference, held at Brown, and featuring many scholars from around the world who came to speak on a very hot August weekend. And at the end of that event, we had the unveiling of the H.P. Lovecraft Memorial Plaque, which is now on the grounds of the John Hay Library. I think a lot of us at that time felt that maybe that was the acme of Lovecraft's recognition. A major university had sponsored a good academic convention. He was a popular writer. Uh-oh, what is this? That. For those of you who are culturally deprived, that was Yes, We Have No Bananas. And why are we playing that today? Because another thing that happened with Mr. Lovecraft is that he came here in 1923 with C.M. Eddy and tried to play that on the organ. But he said it was not a self-starter, so he couldn't get it to work. I suspect he played the organ about the way he typed with two fingers. But, anyway, where was I? All right. 1990, Centennial Conference. We wondered, is this the pinnacle of Lovecraft's recognition? Well, more things were to come. I spent several years writing a full-length biography of Lovecraft, and it was published in 1996 by Necronomicon Press, which was then the leading publisher, small press publisher of Lovecraftiana, run by Mark Michaud, who had done incredible work over the last several decades. Let's give him a hand. That book got some good reviews, but most notably by Joyce Carol Oates in the New York Review of Books. And she called Lovecraft the king of weird. So, very different from what Edmund Wilson had said 50 years before. So now we were getting somewhere. A few years later, Penguin asked me to compile the first of 3 volumes of Lovecraft's annotated stories for Penguin Classics. So at least in the eyes of the Penguin editors, Lovecraft was a classic. And I'm sure that those editions helped to inspire the Library of America to issue its edition of Lovecraft in 2005. And that, I think, represents the ultimate canonization of Mr. H.P. Lovecraft. He had arrived. He was in the canon of American literature, right there with Poe and Hawthorne and Melville and Henry James and Willa Cather and Edith Wharton. He had made it. More things happened around that time. A whole new crop of imaginative writers emerged who drew inspiration from Lovecraft. Unlike many writers of the past who had merely imitated the flamboyant externals of Lovecraft's work, these writers looked deeper, more searchingly into the essence of Lovecraft's cosmic vision, his sense of a humanity alone in the universe and facing a bleak future of ultimate oblivion. Today, such writers as Caitlin Kiernan, Laird Barron, Willem Pugmire, Joe Pulver, Jason Brock, Lois Gresh, Cody Goodfellow, and many others are here today, and they will be speaking about what it means to write in the Lovecraftian literary tradition. And, even more surprisingly, Lovecraft's become a media figure. I mentioned those early film adaptations. Crude as they were, they laid the groundwork for better things to come. For the last 20 years or so, there has been an H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival in Portland, Oregon, every year, run mostly by Andrew Migliori and now taken over by others. And it has featured filmmakers from around the world, showing films short and long. We have filmmakers who have come here this weekend. to discuss the very difficult art of translating Lovecraft's words into images. But there's more than that. Lovecraft's been on television. He's been adapted for comic books, for role-playing games, for interactive games, for rock music, for classical music, and many other media. What has also happened is that Lovecraft has expanded around the world. Those early translations in Europe have given way to still newer editions. Lovecraft is now in Russian, in Estonian, in Turkish, in Serbo-Croatian, in Bengali, in Chinese, in Japanese, in modern Greek. Truly, Lovecraft belongs to the world. And yet, in the most fundamental sense, he remains a uniquely American, a uniquely Rhode Island phenomenon. Let us remember what is written on his tombstone at Swan Point Cemetery, not far from here. I am Providence. I am Providence. What a wealth of meaning lies in those simple words. How profoundly they speak of Lovecraft's attachment to this city. Its architecture, its topography, its history, now almost 400 years old, its people. Lovecraft traveled up and down the eastern seaboard, from Quebec to Key West, but he always came back to Providence. It was not merely his home, it was his haven, his sanctuary. It was the only place he felt he belonged, the only place where he felt he could be the man and the writer he wished to be. And so it is fitting that we have come from the four corners of the earth to celebrate his life and his legacy. I have to believe that he would be pleased. Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing. I remember an article that Barton St. Armand wrote, and I think Barton may be here. Is Barton here? Saying that I believe a Spanish writer had listed Lovecraft as one of the 10 most important writers in the world of any language at any time. So on that note, I did promise 2 surprises in the church. The first one was, yes, we have no bananas. Thank you again, Gigi. Oh, excuse me, that wasn't Gigi. That was, we're not sure what that was. Gigi has one more piece that she would like to play for us, and after that, we'll reveal one more surprise before we go to the opening across the street. One thing that always mystified me about this beautiful building, it's a Baptist church, and I could never find the baptismal tank or the font, but it's a Baptist church. And I was so mystified by it that I actually came to a baptism here to solve the mystery. Now, H.P. Lovecraft was not baptized in this church. He was not baptized at all. The Baptists, of which his aunt and his family was with, felt that baptism happened at the age of 14 to 16 or something like that. And at that point, he had long ago given that up. But with the permission of the First Baptist Church, does anyone know where the baptismal tank is here? So here it is. I don't have the lights on. With a very uncharacteristic stained glass window back there, which is always very carefully kept covered up. Stan, I don't know where the lights are here, but this is the baptistry or the baptismal tank of the First Baptist Church. So that's your second surprise of the weekend. Enjoy your stay in Providence. Thank you to Necronomicon and all the great people who've helped us all around the city in making this possible. And we're going to the opening right across the street, right here. Thank you so much.